The Galactic Academy was not like any school on Earth, for it was built inside a station of shining silver walls that floated among the stars, and in this place young warriors from many worlds came together to learn the art of war, and the science of fear, and the control of minds and hearts, and today they gathered for a lesson called battle psychology. The hall was large and cold, and the seats curved around like steps of a mountain, and in the middle stood the instructor, who was tall and covered in scales of dark green, his eyes narrow and sharp, and his voice like a blade cutting through the silence. He told them that fear was the strongest weapon in the galaxy. He said fear could break armies. Before the battle even began, he said discipline was the key to survival, and obedience was the path to victory. And the alien cadets nodded and whispered because all of them had been raised to believe the same, that war was about breaking the enemy before the first strike. Each word of the instructor echoed heavy in the air. He spoke of armies that collapsed when their commanders lost control. He spoke of warriors who ran when fear entered their hearts. He spoke of species who could not fight because fear had hollowed them and left them weak. And the young cadets believed every word because it fit what they had been told since birth. But among them sat a human cadet. He was quiet in the beginning, and he listened with calm eyes and a calm face, while all the others trembled a little under the weight of the lecture. This human was young, but he did not seem afraid, and when the instructor finished a long speech and asked if anyone wished to add something, the human slowly raised his hand. The hall grew, still the air seemed to pause, because many of the cadets had already learned the humans were strange and often dangerous. They never feared as much as others, and when they did, they turned fear into something else, something that burned instead of froze. The instructor narrowed his reptile eyes and pointed to the human and said, "Speak." And the human cadet stood slowly, his uniform plain, his eyes steady, his voice soft, yet strong enough to travel across the hall. He said, "You speak of fear as if it is a chain, and you speak of discipline as if it is the only shield, but you do not understand how humans fight. You do not understand what keeps us standing when fear comes." The cadets leaned forward curious. Some laughed in whispers, thinking the human would boast foolish words, but the human did not boast. He smiled a little and said, "Let me explain it in the way my people know best. Let me explain it with barbecue." The aliens blinked in confusion. Some tilted their heads, others hissed in laughter, because the word meant nothing to them, and even the instructor frowned, and his tail flicked in irritation. He said, "Barbecue? What nonsense is this? What does food have to do with war?" But the human did not sit down. He stood taller and said everything, because for humans a fire and food shared together is not only food, it is spirit, it is strength, it is the reason why fear does not break us when the world turns dark. The hall grew quiet again. The laughter faded. The cadets whispered, asking one another what this human meant, but none of them understood, for their cultures did not gather around fire in the same way. Their cultures did not build strength from something so simple. The instructor bared sharp teeth and said, "Explain." And the human nodded and said, "When our soldiers face fear, when our families face war, we gather around fire. We cook, we share, we laugh, even when death is near. And in that moment we remember why we fight. We remember that fear cannot take everything from us, because together we are stronger than fear." Some cadets shifted uneasily in their seats. The words of the human felt heavy, though they were simple, because the picture he painted was not about numbers or drills or commands. It was about a kind of strength. None of them had ever been taught, a strength that did not collapse when fear pressed down. The instructor hissed, but said nothing, because his eyes were fixed on the human, as if trying to break him with a stare. But the human did not falter. He kept speaking, his voice steady. He said, "You think fear breaks us, but it does not. It feeds the fire inside us, and that fire is shared just like barbecue." The silence stretched across the hall. The young cadets felt the ground shift beneath what they had believed, and in that silence the first crack formed in the lesson of fear, the first doubt in the power of control, because a single human had spoken of fire and food and togetherness. And though none of them would admit it, yet every cadet knew something had changed in that moment, and the true lesson had only begun. The hall of the Galactic Academy did not move for a long moment after the human spoke of barbecue. The alien cadets sat frozen in their curved seats, and the sound of their shifting wings or tails or claws slowly filled the silence as they tried to make sense of what they had just heard. And still the instructor stood with his scales shining under the white lights, his eyes cold and sharp, and his mind full of disbelief. He had taught hundreds of cadets across many years. He had spoken of fear, discipline, and control so many times that his words had become laws in the hearts of alien soldiers. But now in front of him a young human had dared to speak of fire and meat and laughter, as if such things mattered in the middle of war and battle and death. The reptilian instructor finally spoke, his voice low, but sharp like a blade cutting the air. He said, "You will explain this, human. You will show us how food and fire can stand equal to the art of fear and discipline, and you will answer before every cadet here." The human nodded with no fear, and his eyes glowed with something the aliens could not name. He looked at the faces around him, scaled, feathered, furred, and strange, and he spoke again in a calm and even tone. He said, "You teach that fear is the strongest weapon, but for us fear is not a chain. For us fear is a drum that calls us to gather. It makes us come close and share. And when we share, we cannot be broken. I speak of barbecue not as food, but as the fire that gathers people when the night grows cold and the enemy grows near." The cadets looked at one another, some confused, some laughing, some silent. In unease, a blue-skinned insectoid cadet hissed softly and said, "This is foolishness. Fire and smoke cannot stop blades and cannons, and hunger makes armies weaker, not stronger." And still the human smiled softly, as if he expected such a question. He answered, "When hunger comes to a human army, we do not scatter, we gather, we find even scraps of food, and we place them in fire, and though it is little we make it enough, because we eat together, and in eating together we remember that we fight not for the generals or the numbers, but for each other." The insectoid cadet fell silent, and a bird-like student with feathers of silver tilted her head and said, "But fear crushes the mind. Fear is poison to thought, and how can fire and food cure poison?" And the human lifted his head higher and spoke again. He said, "Fear only crushes the mind when the mind is alone, when it is left in the cold darkness. But when you are by the fire with brothers and sisters beside you, fear cannot grow into poison, because every laugh and every story shared over the fire burns it away." The cadets were not sure if they should laugh or stay silent, but the human kept speaking, and each word painted pictures that none of them could deny. He told of armies that sang songs by fire before battle, and of soldiers who carved jokes into burnt wood even when death walked near. He told of men and women who remembered home through the taste of smoke and salt, and in that memory found strength to keep fighting. The instructor hissed again and slammed his tail on the metal floor, and the sound echoed like thunder. He said, "Enough. You claim these stories prove your point, but words are not proof. Words are nothing without the test." And still the human did not flinch. He looked into the eyes of the instructor and said, "Then test me, test us, and you will see that fire and food and laughter are stronger than the chains of fear." The hall shook with whispers. The cadets buzzed and hissed and muttered, for no one had ever challenged the instructor in such a way before. No one had ever dared to call his lessons incomplete or broken. And yet here was a human speaking with the weight of a mountain behind simple words. The instructor narrowed his eyes and said, "You want a test? Then you will have it. We will place you and others in the simulation chamber. We will bring darkness, cold, hunger, and fear. We will show you illusions of enemies and dangers, and you will see that your fire and food cannot protect you, and your spirit will break like all the rest." The cadets gasped, for the simulation chamber was feared by all. It was a place that could craft nightmares from nothing. It was a place where young cadets were tested until they collapsed and begged for release, and many failed their first time inside. Yet the human only nodded, as if this was expected. He said, "Then I accept. And when I build my fire, and when I gather my people, and when we laugh even as shadows close, and you will understand." The cadets murmured more loudly. Now some laughed in open disbelief, others whispered with nervous awe. One whispered that humans were reckless, another whispered that humans were insane, but none could deny that they were curious. None could deny that they wanted to see if the human would survive what no one had survived before. The instructor turned his eyes across the room and said, "Tomorrow we test him. Tomorrow every cadet will see, and tomorrow his words will break like ash in the wind, and his talk of fire and food will be forgotten." The cadets filed out of the hall, their steps echoing against the metal ground, each one carrying whispers of the strange human who had spoken of barbecue and a lesson of fear. Some thought him a fool, some thought him a madman, and a few thought he was something far more dangerous, because he did not tremble when he spoke, and his words carried the weight of unshaken truth. The human remained still for a long moment after the hall emptied, his eyes fixed on the cold metal floor. Then he turned and walked away, his steps steady, his breath calm, his heart full of fire, because he knew that tomorrow would not break him. Tomorrow would prove what no alien wanted to believe. Tomorrow would show that fear could not bend the human spirit. And in the dark corners of the station, whispers already grew that perhaps the lesson of fear would not survive the light of a single human fire. The next day the cadets gathered again, and the air inside the great hall of the simulation chamber was heavy with curiosity and hidden fear. The walls of the chamber rose high like cliffs of steel, and above them the cold lights glowed pale, while shadows crawled across the corners. Every species had come to watch, for the word had spread like fire in dry grass. The human would face the simulation, and his strange talk of barbecue would be tested. The reptilian instructor stood at the center, his scales gleaming and his tail moving back and forth with sharp anger. He announced that the chamber would be set to its highest level, the setting called Endless Night, a program designed to crush will and mind with cold illusions, hunger, and endless danger. And as he spoke, the cadets whispered that no first year had ever lasted long. An endless night. Yet the human only stood calm, his face steady and his eyes bright with something that made the others uneasy. The instructor pointed, and the heavy doors of the chamber opened with a sound like grinding stone. Inside was nothing but blackness, and the human stepped forward. Without hesitation the door closed behind him, and silence fell over the crowd until the screens above the hall lit up, showing the vision of the simulation inside. The endless night began with a cold wind and a barren land. The ground cracked and broke in the sky, full of ash and shadow. Illusions of enemies lurked in the distance, shadows with claws and teeth that never stopped moving. Hunger was built into the program. No food would be given, and no warmth would be found, and the very air was heavy with despair, designed to press down on the mind until the will collapsed. The human walked slowly through the dark land, and the first illusions of beasts moved toward him. The cadets, watching, expected him to fight or to run, yet he did neither. He gathered broken branches from the cracked ground and piled them together. He struck stone against stone until sparks grew into a flame, and soon a small fire glowed in the middle of the endless night. The cadets gasped in disbelief, for none of them had thought to make fire in the simulation. They had always tried to fight or flee, yet the human had chosen to build a fire. And as the flames rose, his face glowed warm and calm. The beasts circled him, but did not strike. They were shadows meant to feed on fear, yet the human did not fear. Instead, he sat by the fire and reached into his pack, where he had carried dried food from his own ration, not given by the program, but smuggled in with human stubbornness. He placed the food near the fire, and the smell began to spread through the simulation. Even though it was only an illusion, the program amplified everything. So the warmth of the fire grew brighter, and the smell of roasted food grew stronger, and even the watching cadets outside thought they could almost taste it. The human began to speak softly, as if telling a story to unseen friends. He spoke of soldiers who once sat in mud and cold, yet still found ways to roast scraps of bread and meat over tiny flames. He spoke of a time when men surrounded by enemies chose to laugh instead of cry, and made jokes about smoke rising into the sky, as if to taunt the stars themselves. The cadets outside leaned forward, listening to every word, and though the beasts in the simulation howled and circled, the human did not falter. He threw another branch into the fire and smiled at the light, as if he were sitting with companions rather than alone inside a nightmare program. Then something strange happened. A program designed to twist the mind began to shift. The beasts slowed their movements, and the shadows pulled back, for the endless night was built to use fear as fuel. And without fear the illusions grew weaker. The fire burned brighter, in contrast to the cold dark, and the human seemed stronger instead of weaker. The instructor hissed in anger, but he said nothing, because even he could see that the program was faltering against something it was never built to face. The cadets whispered louder, now some saying the human was clever, others saying the human was mad, but none could deny what they saw. The human kept speaking, his voice steady and calm. He said, "Fear does not break us. When we share fire, when we share food, we remember why we stand, and that memory is stronger than fear." He told of warriors who sang while roasting food even as enemy shells fell around them. He told of families who survived winters by gathering around fire when nothing else remained, and he told of how each flame was not only light, but a promise that tomorrow could still come. The cadets felt a weight in their chests as they listened, and even those who mocked him the night before now watched with quiet eyes, for his words painted pictures that their own lessons of fear and control had never shown. Inside the simulation, the human ate calmly, and the beasts finally vanished, unable to feed on his spirit. The darkness remained, yet it did not touch him. The cold wind blew, yet the fire stood strong, and the human stretched out his hands toward the flame, with a smile not of victory, but of peace. The instructor struck the control board with his claw to raise the level higher. Storms filled the simulation. Lightning split the sky. The ground shook. Illusions of massive armies appeared in the distance, but the human did not panic. He only fed his fire and spoke louder. He said, "Storms come and go, but fire stays. If we keep feeding it, armies may surround us, but as long as we share food and laugh together, we cannot be broken." The simulation trembled. The screens flickered as the program struggled to match his will, and still the cadets stared in awe, for the endless night that had broken so many before could not break one human who carried only sparks and words and food. Minutes passed, then hours, and still the human sat by his fire, calm and unshaken, until finally the instructor slammed the controls and ended the program. The doors of the chamber opened with a heavy roar of metal, and the human stepped out, smoke clinging to his clothes, his face calm, his eyes steady, and not even a trace of fear upon him. The cadets were silent, their hearts pounding with the truth of what they had seen, and for the first time many of them understood that the human had not spoken foolishness when he spoke of barbecue and fire and food, for he had shown them that fear, which ruled their lessons, could be defeated by something so simple and yet so unshakable. The instructor glared, his eyes filled with rage, but also with something else, something he refused to name, perhaps respect, perhaps fear, and the cadets whispered more loudly. Now they whispered that humans were not like the others. They whispered that humans could not be broken the way they had been taught, and they whispered that the lesson of fear had been torn apart by the light of one small fire. And the humans simply looked at them all and said, "This is why you will never understand us until you sit with us by the fire and share food and laughter, even in the face of the night." The chamber doors closed behind the human, and the sound echoed through the vast academy hall. The cadets remained silent, their minds filled with what they had just seen. The simulation that had broken hundreds before had failed to break him. The fire he built, the food he roasted, the calm words he spoke, all of it had turned the endless night into nothing more than shadows without teeth. And the cadets whispered to one another with uneasy voices, for they knew they had seen something that could not be explained by the old lessons of fear. The reptilian instructor stepped forward, his scales rattling and his long tail striking the ground with each movement. His eyes glared sharp as blades, and his voice thundered across the hall. He said, "Silence. There's no proof here. You see only tricks. The simulation is flawed. The human is clever, but cleverness is not strength. Fire is not strength. Food is not strength. Fear is the only true strength, and I will not let one strange creature break the foundation of our teachings." But the human stood calm before him, his face unshaken, and his eyes steady like a flame that could not be moved by wind. He said, "You call fear strength, but what you saw was the weakness of fear. It feeds only when the heart is alone. It breaks only when the spirit is hollow. But when we gather, when we share, when we laugh, fear starves until it dies. That is what you refuse to see." The cadets stirred in their seats, some still clinging to the words of their instructor, others feeling their hearts pull toward the truth of the humans. Fire, a young avian cadet, raised his wing and said, "Teacher, if the simulation is flawed, then why did it break us? But not him if it is weakness. Then why do his words feel stronger than yours?" And the murmur of agreement spread like ripples through water. The instructor snarled and slammed his claws into the steel floor. Sparks leapt with the strike, and the hall trembled with the sound. He turned to the cadets and roared, "You are fools. You are young and weak. You do not see what fear can do. I have seen entire planets burn because fear broke their armies. I have seen rulers crawl on their knees because fear hollowed their hearts. And you dare to question me because a single human made a fire in an illusion." Yet even as he shouted, the cadets did not look convinced. They whispered again of the calm they had seen in the human, the warmth of his fire, the strength of his spirit that did not bend, and the instructor felt the ground beneath his authority start to shake. The human stepped forward until he stood only a few paces away from the tall reptilian figure. He spoke not in anger, but in simple, steady words. He said, "You think control holds armies together, but control without hope is a cage. You think fear makes warriors fight, but fear without love makes them run. But give them fire, give them food, give them laughter, and even when death is close, they will not fall, they will stand, because they are not fighting for commands, they are fighting for one another." The instructor hissed deep in his throat, his eyes narrowing to slits. He said, "You speak pretty words, human, but words do not win wars. Discipline wins wars, order wins wars, terror wins wars. And if you wish to prove me wrong, then fight me here. In front of all, let us see if your fire can stand against the claws of truth." The cadets gasped in unison, for never had an instructor challenged a student. In such a way the hall grew heavy with silence, as every eye turned toward the human and the reptile warrior, who towered above him. The human looked up and answered in the same calm tone, I will not fight you with claws. I will not fight you with blades, for that would only prove your lesson. I will fight you with what you cannot defeat." The instructor laughed, a harsh sound like steel grinding against stone. He said, "Then you have already lost." And he spread his claws wide, his body tense, his teeth sharp. But the human only shook his head and walked slowly to the center of the hall, where a small stand held a heating unit used by technicians for repairs. He bent down, switched it on, and soon a small flame flickered into life. The cadets leaned forward as the human reached into his pack again and pulled out more dried rations. He placed them above the flame, and the smell spread across the hall, warm and rich and strange to alien senses, yet heavy with something that stirred even hearts that had never known such food. The human looked at the cadets and said, "This is my weapon, this is my proof." And he began to tell another story as the food cooked slowly in the heat. He spoke of soldiers trapped in frozen trenches who kept their spirit alive by roasting small bits of meat on broken barrels. He spoke of wanderers lost in endless deserts who found hope again when they shared water and dried bread around a small flame. He spoke of children who laughed around a fire even while the sky burned with enemy ships. And he said, "Do you see, we do not fight because we are forced. We fight because we refuse to let go of one another, and fear cannot kill that." The cadets listened with wide eyes, and some felt tears form, though they did not know why. Their own lessons had told them fear was master, but the human showed them something deeper. The instructor snarled again and rushed forward, his claws slashing through the air as if to end the lesson with force. But before he reached the human, the cadets themselves rose from their seats, dozens of them standing between the two. They shouted, "No!" They shouted, "Let him speak!" They shouted, "We want to hear!" And the instructor froze, his claws hovering above the young students, their bodies trembling, yet their eyes firm, for the fire of the human had spread into them, and they would not let it be crushed. The hall shook not with claws or with fear, but with the sound of voices, united the cadets from many worlds, standing together for a simple flame and a simple truth. The instructor drew back his hand slowly, his breath heavy, his eyes burning with rage, and yet behind the rage something else, something he had not felt in years, doubt. The human looked at him calmly and said, "You can strike me, you can burn me, you can try to bury me under your fear, but my fire will live in them now, and you cannot kill it, you cannot break what is shared, and you cannot win against those who fight for each other." The cadets raised their voices louder until the hall thundered with their cries, and the instructor finally stepped back, his tail whipping the ground, his jaw tight with fury. He turned away and left the hall in silence, broken not by claw or by blade, but by the simple, unshakable truth, spoken by a single human with a fire and a story. And as the cadets looked at the small flame still burning on the repair unit, they knew the old lesson had collapsed, and a new one had begun. The academy could not contain the whispers that spread after the clash between the human and the reptilian instructor. The story traveled through the corridors like wind through broken stone. Every cadet spoke of the fire, every cadet spoke of the food, every cadet spoke of the way the human's words had turned fear into nothing. And even the staff, who had trained for many cycles, could not explain what had happened, for the endless night had failed for the first time, and the hall itself had become a place of defiance. The reptilian instructor burned with rage, his pride wounded, his authority cracked. He called a council of teachers and declared that the human had used tricks, that he had deceived the young cadets with illusions and weak stories, and that such dangerous nonsense could not be allowed to stand. Yet the others on the council were not so sure, for they too had seen the fire. They too had felt something stir in their hearts, though they refused to speak it aloud. The decision came swift to silence doubt, and to end the whispers. They would create a demonstration, one beyond question, one where all cadets would face the same trial, side by side, humans and aliens together against the endless night, in a grand version of the simulation chamber, where the audience could watch every detail from above. If the human failed, then all would see his weakness. If he succeeded, then perhaps the old teachings themselves would have to bend. The next day the cadets gathered once again, this time in the largest chamber. The walls stretched like cliffs, and the seats, filled with thousands, the noise of wings, claws, and voices blended into a storm of expectation. The air smelled of metal and heat and tension. The instructors stood along the edges, their eyes sharp, as they waited for the demonstration to begin. At the center, the reptilian instructor announced the rules. He said, "You will be placed in the simulation, with no weapons, no tools, no aid, but your own spirit. The endless night will come with hunger, with storms, with illusions of endless enemies. You will stand together, or you will fall apart. Let us see if the humans' fire and food can save you when the dark grows endless." The doors opened, and the chosen cadets stepped forward, a mix of species, tall and short, feathered and scaled and furred, and among them the human stood calm, his face showing neither fear nor pride, only a steady flame in his eyes. They entered the chamber, and the heavy doors closed, sealing them into the world of shadow. The screens above came alive, showing the wasteland of the endless night. Once more the cracked ground, the burning sky, the howling wind, the shadows of enemies moving like smoke with claws sharper than knives. The cadets inside felt the cold cut into them like teeth. Some already shivered, their hearts pounding with the pressure of fear, yet the human wasted no time. He began gathering broken branches scattered across the simulation ground. He called to the others, "Come help me gather, we must build a fire." And many looked at him confused, some hissed, some growled, some shook their heads, saying, "This is foolish. We must fight, we must prepare for attack." Yet he only kept moving, and said, "If you fight without warmth, you will fall. If you face fear alone, you will break. Help me, and you will see." A few cadets, uncertain but curious, moved to his side. A bird-like cadet carried pieces of dry reed. An insectoid cadet brought fragments of bark. Together they built a pile, and the human struck stone against stone until sparks grew into flame, and once again a fire burned inside the endless night. The shadows circled, the cadets growled and hissed, illusions of beasts screamed through the wind, but the fire's glow pushed back the dark, and the cadets who had gathered around felt a strange warmth, not only against their skin, but inside their hearts. The human took the small rations he had hidden. Once more, dried meat, dried bread, nothing of great power, yet when roasted above the flame the smell spread, and the cadets felt hunger rise, yet instead of despair they felt their hands steady. The human passed pieces of food to them and said, "Eat together, not because it fills your stomach, but because it fills your spirit." And as they chewed the simple food, they felt their fear lessen, their eyes grew brighter, their breath steadier. The illusions of beasts slowed their movements, because the endless night fed on fear, and fear was no longer so easy to find. Other cadets, watching from a distance, frowned at first, but soon their hearts wavered as they saw the ones by the fire laughing and telling stories. The human told a tale of warriors trapped in mountains who roasted roots together and survived storms that should have killed them. He spoke of soldiers who turned broken metal into skewers to cook scraps of food even when surrounded by enemies. And he said, "Do you see, every flame is not just heated as hope, and hope is what fear cannot touch." Slowly more cadets walked closer, at first only to feel the warmth, but then to sit and listen, and finally to share. They brought what little the simulation allowed, twigs, bits of cloth scraps, and they added them to the fire until it burned higher and higher. The circle grew, and the shadows shrank, and the endless night trembled under the power of unity. Outside, the audience gasped, the instructors whispered in disbelief. The reptilian teacher slammed his claws against the railing, but his words carried no weight against the sight before them, for the cadets, who should have collapsed under fear, were instead standing taller, their voices louder, their spirits unbroken. The simulation shifted harder, storms raged, lightning cracked the ground, illusions of vast armies appeared marching closer, yet the cadets did not scatter this time. They gathered around the fire, singing in their many voices, strange and broken, yet strong. The human stood in the center, feeding the flame, and smiling not with victory, but with quiet pride, as he watched fear lose its grip. Hours passed, and still they stood together, none falling, none crying, none running, until at last the simulation itself began to fail. The darkness peeled away, the armies vanished, the storms fell silent, because the endless night, without fear to feed on, was nothing but empty code, and the chamber returned to light. The doors opened, the cadets stepped out one by one, their eyes wide, their faces alive with energy, and the human walked among them with the same steady calm as before. The hall above erupted with noise, voices shouting disbelief, voices shouting wonder, and voices shouting fear, for they had all seen the power of a fire against the strongest weapon they had known. The reptilian instructor stood trembling with rage, his tail whipping against the floor. Yet he could not deny what had happened. Every cadet had witnessed it, every teacher had seen it. The demonstration meant to destroy the human's words had instead destroyed his own. The human looked at him across the hall and said softly, but clearly so all could hear, "Fear is your weapon, but it cannot rule forever, because when we gather, when we share food and fire, your weapon dies, and nothing you create will ever break us." The cadets roared in agreement, and the hall shook with their voices, and the instructor lowered his head, for he knew his lesson of fear had collapsed completely before the eyes of all. The academy did not sleep after the demonstration, for the halls and chambers buzzed with whispers. Like endless rivers of sound, cadets carried the story across every level of the station. They spoke of the human who built a fire inside the endless night and turned fear into nothing. They spoke of the food he shared that tasted like courage, and they spoke of the laughter that rose even when shadows closed. And the old words of the instructors began to feel hollow, and the young hearts of many species began to shift. The reptilian instructor who once ruled with fear found himself walking through corridors where whispers followed him like chains. Cadets who once trembled at his presence now stared with uncertain eyes, for the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each retelling of the fire and the food and the strange human who refused to bow to terror. The council of instructors gathered again, their faces grim and their voices sharp. They argued through the night, one saying the human must be expelled for spreading weakness, another saying he must be silenced before his words spread further. Yet there were some who remained quiet, their eyes distant, for they too had felt something stir when they saw the flame, and they were not ready to admit that their own lessons of fear had begun to crumble. Inside the cadet dormitories, young soldiers sat together in groups, no longer speaking of drills or punishments. Instead, they asked one another, "What did you feel when you saw the fire? What did you feel when you smelled the food? What did you feel when the human spoke of hope?" Some admitted they felt warmth, some admitted they felt safe, and others whispered that for the first time they believed they could fight without being broken by fear. The human remained calm through it all. He walked the corridors with steady steps, his eyes soft, but burning inside with quiet strength. He spoke to those who asked him questions, not with pride, but with simple stories. He told of fires built in trenches, of laughter shared in caves, of food roasted even as enemy bombs fell, and he repeated the same truth: fear cannot break those who stand together. Fear cannot control those who share the flame. The reptilian instructor confronted him one evening in the empty hall, his tail striking the floor again and again, his voice filled with fury. He said, "You have poisoned their minds. You have undone years of training with your nonsense about fire and food." And the human looked at him without anger and replied, "I have not poisoned them. I have only reminded them of something you tried to bury. Fear is strong, but it is not the only strength, and you know it." The instructor's claws trembled, but he said nothing more, for in his heart he remembered battles where soldiers broke even while obeying every order. He remembered warriors who fled though they had been trained to stand without question. He remembered the silence of fear that hollowed armies until nothing remained, and deep inside, though he hated it, he knew the human spoke truth. The next great lecture was called by the council. Every cadet filled the hall. Every instructor stood on the platform. The reptilian leader raised his voice and tried to speak once more of fear, discipline, and control. But as the words echoed through the chamber, they no longer carried the weight they once held. The cadets looked at one another, restless, uneasy, and when he spoke of fear as the strongest weapon, many shook their heads quietly. Then the human rose from his seat, and without being asked, he walked to the center, his steps calm and firm. The hall hushed, every eye fixed on him, and he said, "Your lesson has collapsed because it was built on chains, and chains always break. But fire does not break, laughter does not break, food shared between friends does not break." He turned to the cadets and said, "You saw it with your own eyes. The endless night is nothing when we stand together, when we gather around flame and remember why we fight." The cadets shouted in answer, their voices shaking the walls. Some cried words of agreement, others simply cheered, but all of them felt the truth of his words in their bones. The reptilian instructor tried to silence them, his tail slamming against the floor, his voice roaring above theirs, but the sound of unity was louder than him, louder than claws, louder than threats, louder than fear itself. The council could no longer deny it. Before them stood not just a human cadet, but a spark that had lit an entire academy. The teachings of fear that had ruled for generations now looked like ruins beside the simple flame of hope, and the collapse of the old lesson was complete. In the days that followed, training itself began to change. Drills were no longer built only on terror, but on unity. Exercises no longer focused on breaking the will, but on building bonds. Cadets began to share meals in the evenings, not in silence, but in laughter. The fire became a symbol passed from one group to another, sometimes a real flame in a safe chamber, sometimes only a candle, but always a reminder that fear was not master anymore. The reptilian instructor withdrew from the center of the academy, his voice no longer a blade, his authority no longer iron. He walked alone through the halls, and though rage still burned in him, doubt burned deeper. He had believed fear eternal and unshakable, yet a single human had shown him its cracks. The human, meanwhile, grew into something greater than a student. For cadets of every species came to him, not as a commander, but as a friend. They asked him to tell more stories, and he told them of riverside fires, of desert fires, of mountain fires, each tale, simple each tale, carrying the same truth, that people fight hardest when they remember they are not alone. And in time, even some instructors who had first doubted began to listen, their pride heavy, their eyes dark with conflict, yet their ears drawn to the truth, for they too had fought battles where fear broke their lines, and they too wondered what might have been if they had known the power of a flame and a meal and a laugh shared before the storm. The collapse of the old lesson was not loud like a battle, it was slow and steady like stone breaking underwater. It was seen in the way cadets no longer trembled when fear was spoken of. It was seen in the way they began to believe in each other more than in commands. It was seen in the way laughter returned to the cold metal halls of the academy. And the human stood at the heart of it all, not seeking power, not seeking praise, only carrying his quiet fire and passing it to others until the old shadows could no longer hold. The academy moved forward into days that felt strange and new, for the old lesson of fear had collapsed like brittle glass shattered under a steady hand, and though the instructors still tried to hold their grip on order, the cadets no longer looked at fear as a chain around their necks. Instead, they looked to one another, to the fires they now made in secret corners of the dormitory, to the laughter they shared after long drills, to the taste of food traded across species boundaries, and the spirit that grew from these small flames was stronger than any command. The reptilian instructor, once proud and unbending, now walked alone through the halls, his tail dragging behind him, his eyes dim, for he had seen his words lose their weight. He had seen cadets rise against his roar. He had seen a single human prove him wrong in front of all, and the shame burned deeper than any wound he had ever taken in war. Yet behind that shame lay something. He could not destroy a small part of him that wondered if perhaps the human was right. The council met again, their chambers filled with arguments. Some voices demanded punishment for the human, claiming he had weakened the academy and broken tradition. Others said nothing at all, their silence heavy with the truth that tradition had already broken itself when it failed before the endless night. A few dared to speak softly, saying maybe the academy should change. Maybe the fire of the human was not weakness, but the strength they had missed for ages. And though these words were few, they were seeds that would not die. In the dormitories, the cadets gathered nightly around small hidden flames, sometimes real, sometimes only light from a device shaped into the form of fire, yet always burning bright in their minds. They cooked simple food together, dried rations and crumbs turned into meals that felt like feasts because they were shared. They told stories and sang, and in those moments fear held no power over them, and each new flame made them less afraid of the next day's trials. The human did not seek to lead, but still he became the heart of these gatherings. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of rivers. He reminded them of the first fire in the endless night. He reminded them of the strength that rose when they shared food, and he reminded them that fear was never the master unless they allowed it to be. He never claimed to destroy the old ways. He only showed that there was another way, a way that made armies stand when logic said they should fall. The instructors began to notice the difference in training drills. Cadets no longer broke under simulated terror. They no longer crumbled when shadows pressed close. Instead, they looked to one another, they shouted together, they remembered the fire, and they endured the endless night. Lost its grip over them, and the tests built on fear no longer worked as before, for fear that once ruled had been stripped of its throne. The reptilian instructor finally returned to the human one late night. In a silent corridor, his scales dull, his claws heavy, he stared at the young soldier, with eyes full of storm, and said, "You have undone me, you have made my words hollow, what have you left me with now?" And the human looked at him not with pride, but with calm. He said, "I left you with truth, you built on fear, and fear broke itself. Now you can choose to build again, but this time build on fire, and you will see it will not fall." The instructor said nothing at first. His chest rose and fell with heavy breath. Then he turned and walked away, but his steps were slower and his shoulders lower, and the human knew the battle inside him had only just begun. Word of what happened at the academy did not stay inside its walls, for cadets carried it home in messages to their families, in whispers to their commanders, in quiet stories that slipped through the cracks of military order across systems. The tale spread of a human who lit a fire in the dark and turned fear into smoke across worlds. The story traveled, told and retold, until it grew into something larger than a single lesson. Armies began to notice changes. Soldiers asked for shared meals before battle. Commanders found their lines stronger when laughter passed among the ranks, and slowly even those who had mocked began to admit that fear was not the strongest weapon after all, for something deeper had risen from a single flame. The human remained the same through it all. He trained, he studied, he fought, he laughed, he ate with others, never placing himself above them, never raising himself higher than any cadet. Yet his presence alone carried weight, for wherever he walked whispers of fire followed, and wherever he sat small circles of warmth grew around him like invisible flames. The academy itself transformed over time. The endless night simulation, once feared above all, became a place where cadets went not to be broken, but to be united. Groups entered together, not trembling, but carrying small devices to make fire. Within it they faced the shadows not alone, but as one. They roasted scraps they shared, and the program lost its teeth. And in this way training shifted from chains to bonds, from obedience to unity, from fear to courage. The reptilian instructor stood one day at the edge of such a session, his eyes heavy as he watched the cadets laugh. Inside the dark chamber, for the first time in his long years of teaching, he realized he had built an empire of fear only to see it crumble before one small fire. And though it hurt like claws driven into his chest, he also felt something he had not felt in years. He felt hope. The final lecture of the term came, and the council demanded a speech from the human before all cadets and teachers. He stood before them, not in armor, not with weapons, only with a simple uniform and his steady voice. He said, "You thought fear was the greatest power, but it was not. You thought control would hold you, but it broke. You thought terror was eternal, but it faded. Yet the fire remains, because it is shared, because it is love, because it is hope. That is why no army of humans will ever fall to fear, and that is why no enemy will ever truly break us." The hall shook with the sound of voices rising together. Cadets of many species shouted in answer, their voices united into one. The old lesson lay dead at their feet, the new one burned in their hearts, and the academy itself would never be the same again. And when the human finished speaking, he simply smiled and sat among them. No throne, no crown, no command, only another flame among many, for that was enough for him and enough for them.